morning. It's just like a regular Carolina Public Humanities event. It's such a delight to be with you here. I'm in the music building, and we have taken up 4 spaces in the music building to bring this to you. So we appreciate your patience with us this morning as we set up in Meeser Auditorium in Hill Hall 103, in the Rotunda, and then also here in this office. But all of that complexity is worth it to mimic what we usually do, which is to join you on a Saturday morning to discuss our great academic content. So first of all, just a quick brief background. This was originally scheduled to be a live dialogues event in May. We thought very ambitiously that it would be our live event this fall. As all of you know, circumstances with our situation have dictated that we are really staying in the virtual world. So we have so many people to thank. Very quickly, I want to, of course, thank our sponsors. Our Cotton Merca Group at Morgan Stanley have always been a great support for us, and we're very thankful for their continued support of our programs, in particular our K-12 programs. Carolina Meadows, a wonderful retirement community here in Chapel Hill, has been, of course, a longtime supporter of our public-facing programs and have recently joined to support our K-12 programming as well. We, of course, want to thank our partner, the General Alumni Association, with whom we are doing all sorts of great work, including our Lunch with Friends and Strangers talks, which we encourage you to come and join up. And of course, we encourage everyone to join the General Alumni Association for the great discounts that they offer. And of course, it's a wonderful community. So I want to thank everyone there and all of our partners. Today, we have a few special people to thank. Of course, we always want to thank Paul Bonici. If you could see the miles of cords that are strung out all over Hill Hall, and the several times you've been here to prepare for this, you would understand how hard Paul Bonici has been working at this. So I want to thank Paul in particular for all that he's done. And we have great help here from Jesse Moorfield from the music department as well, who's also again done tireless work setting up the beautiful piano that you're going to hear very soon, and all of the stage work and helping us get all this. So thank you, Jesse. Also, David Garcia from the music department, Jeffrey Fuchs, Kat Zachary, all have been just such a great help to us in promoting, putting this on, and allowing us access to this space. Of course, we want to thank our speakers as well, but we want to cut right to it. Yes, Paul is saying if you see Jesse, buy him a drink of his choice. We couldn't have done this without his help. Absolutely, and keep our fingers crossed that everything is going to go just like swimmingly, but we know that we can rely on the expert help that Jesse is offering us. I promised that I would keep my introduction short. We will be able to present some of our upcoming programs in the intermission, but we really want to make sure we can get to our content. So without further ado, we're going to switch virtually from me to there he is, Robert Buxton. Robert, I can see you. Can you hear me, Robert? Robert cannot hear me, but Robert is going to be given the cue to go, and he'll be able to hear me when we ask the questions. That's one of the tricky things here. We're all in different places, but we're going to give Robert the cue to start here in any moment. We're going to drop information on Robert Buxton into the chat box. I just want to say one thing about Robert. He was very gracious in joining us and agreeing to do this presentation with us, but he also was going to be doing a whole separate thing for our Flyleaf Summer Series on Chopin. So we do hope to have Robert back for that as well. But without further ado, I'm going to ask my colleagues to cue Robert Buxton and let him know that he can begin.
David Garcia in the music department. I just want to thank all of these people and more for everything that they've done to make this event work in rather unusual times, we could say. And it's a little bit strange for me because I have not done a performance or an event since the beginning of COVID. So it's refreshing, but it's also a little bit, I'm a little bit not at ease, so forgive me for the butterflies. But at any rate, today I'll be speaking about Vienna, and I'll be playing several piano compositions that illustrate high points in the musical history of this city. Now, it would be impossible to discuss all facets of Viennese musical life in about an hour, but we can at least talk about some small points and illustrate or hint at what is a bigger picture. Now, the theme for my talk today is the difference between the myth of Vienna and the reality. And I think that the myth is something that we hang on to today. The waltzes of Johann Strauss Jr., the operettas of Lehar. Perhaps you've seen one of the New Year's Day concerts on PBS. I love all of those things, by the way, but I also believe that they contribute to a mythology concerning Vienna, that Vienna is just this purely lighthearted city. And the truth is less clear cut, but perhaps it's more fascinating, I would say. And the truth of Vienna is that it was a melting pot, musically and just as a city in general. And to really grasp this melting pot, I think we should look at this map of the Holy Roman Empire over here. And this shows the Holy Roman Empire in its different manifestations from the Middle Ages up until the time of Napoleon. And as you can see, countries that are now known as Austria, Germany, Italy, even parts of France, Czech Republic, were part of this body. Not to go too deeply into this, but I think Voltaire sums it up best. He said that this body, the Holy Roman Empire, it's not holy, it's not Roman, and it's not an empire. And that's really true because it was a loose conglomeration of municipalities, principalities with different kings and nobility, emperors, and it was just not a unified whole. But they somehow was this alliance. And people at this time, they traveled like crazy and they spoke many languages, still do in Central Europe. Um, I think that a great description is a quote from Charles V, who, by the way, was not only a Habsburg emperor, but was also a king of Spain at some point. So there was a connection between the Habsburgs and Spain. So Charles V said, apparently, he said that one speaks Spanish with the gods, French with the ladies, Flemish with human beings. I believe he was Franco-Flemish, his origin. Maybe wrong there. One speaks Italian with the birds, English with the horses, and German with the dogs. It's a little bit derogatory towards German, but that's how people were at this. I mean, it was just that Vienna was this melting pot. And it still is, you could say. And supposedly Empress Maria Theresa, another famous Habsburg, her command of German was not so strong. So this potpourri of influences, it appears, for one thing, I've heard that the Austrian or the Viennese dialect, rather, of German is influenced by Spanish speech. And also the architecture of Vienna is influenced by these many different things. Now, to add even more interest, well, after the Holy Roman Empire, we have the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 19th century. And so also Hungary and Eastern European culture has always been so influential in Vienna. In fact, one of the principal dishes you'd eat in Vienna is goulash, which is Hungarian originally. So to make this even more confusing, there's a Turkish influence on the city because the Ottoman Turks, recall in the 16th and 17th centuries, they nearly invaded the city. So all you need to think about in this case is Mozart's Rondo alla Turca. It's alluding to Turkish culture. So I think that we can make a connection with New Orleans here. Ken Burns, in his jazz documentary, the first episode is called Gumbo, denoting how so many different musical influences and cultural differences mingled in this melting pot that was New Orleans, and jazz is born out of this. And I think you could say a very similar thing about Vienna. So the myth is not only concerning the waltzes and operettas, but there's also this myth of a Viennese classical school. The truth is, Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven and Schubert, they never really sat in a room together and considered themselves to be this. So, but the notion of a Viennese classical school emerged in the late 19th century when these composers, Schubert, Beethoven, Mozart, were posthumously canonized. And actually, Schubert, for instance, was hardly known. He was in poverty most of his life. It's hardly known during his short lifetime. So, but it was later in the 19th century that Viennese, they decided that, oh, Schubert is this great poster boy for the city. And you could say that many Viennese at this time engaged in escapist golden age thinking. And this was because there were turbulent current events. There was an economic crash in 1873. There was a lot of immigration, mainly from Eastern Europe. So the city was growing, but the power economically of the city politically was declining. The Habsburgs were in decline, Emperor Franz Joseph under his reign. So this is, I think, a reaction to that, this building of this canon. Um, if you really go back to the 18th century, we need to consider other musical centers. Berlin, the court of King Frederick the Great. Mannheim, where the great Mannheim composers, where the symphony, the orchestral form of the symphony as we know it is really born, you could say. Also Paris and London, which were larger cities than Vienna with stronger economies. And even the piano technology, the piano building in Paris and London, they built, you could say, sturdier instruments than the Viennese. Beethoven was notorious for breaking Viennese pianos when he played. You may see why when I play. But eventually he acquired a Broadwood, a London Broadwood with a cast iron frame, similar to what we have now. And so Beethoven could really play into the keys as he liked. So I think also we need to consider the brilliant composers who lived and flourished in these cities, Clementi, Duschek, Kramer, and many others. So Vienna is one among many. It's not the single music capital. But I'm not here to sort of disparage Vienna. I just think that if we look at the bigger picture, the context, I think it's even more fascinating because Vienna has its own, it does have its own special sound and it's a mood to its music. I mean, all of these individuals, these composers are different, but there is some thread that runs through them all and through their styles. And I think you could also say that instrumental music flourished in Vienna, particularly piano music, despite the beautiful tone, by the way, these Viennese instruments, but the smaller construction, you know. So musical institutions were, from the beginning, they were there. The Habsburgs promoted music like crazy from the beginning. Then there was in the 19th century the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde, the Society of Friends of Music, and it's now the building is the Musikverein where the Vienna Philharmonic plays, and Brahms was director of this organization in the 19th century. So there were many patrons who funded the arts. Beethoven, we'll talk about him in a bit, but Beethoven had a number of patrons, aristocratic patrons. So this is why composers like Mozart and Beethoven, they could operate in Vienna sort of as free agents or freelancers, you could call it that, and that their creative impulses could flourish in instrumental music in this city. So before getting into the music itself, I think it would be good to speak a little bit about some landmarks of the city. So I'm going to switch slides here. So these are some landmarks in Vienna that you could visit if you get a chance to go there, hopefully sooner than later. We have St. Stephen's Cathedral as a landmark of the city, and Joseph Haydn and his brother Michael, they sang in the choir there as boys. There's the Mozart House. I won't speak about all of these. Mozart apparently, by the way, lived in a very luxurious apartment. He had a nice income. Apparently he had a spending problem though, so that's another topic for another day. But we see the Musikverein where the Gesellschaft was and where the Vienna Philharmonic plays today. Let's see if this works. Johann Strauss Monument, of course. Yeah. And several other, the Vienna Staatsoper, a very important place. Schubert's birthplace. Café Central, where many writers and musicians would congregate. There was a real cafe culture, as in Paris, in Vienna. And here's a map of the city center. You see the Danube River on the beautiful blue Danube, Johann Strauss. So, but anyway, very quickly, I want to speak a little bit about early Vienna. So Vienna, the place of Vienna was originally, I believe, a Roman military fort of some kind. So this is really going way back. And one of the scholars I was reading about early music in Vienna sort of laments the fact that because of the pervasiveness of the mythology of Vienna of the 18th and 19th centuries and 20th, there's not a whole lot of discussion about earlier Viennese music. So there's area for more scholarship, you could say. So in the Renaissance, or the Middle Ages rather, Minnesänger, or traveling troubadours, German-speaking troubadours, were in the city. And the two most prominent names of composers were a couple Franco-Flemish, actually Heinrich Isaac, Franco-Flemish composer, and the Swiss-born Ludwig Zenfel, who was a student. So see, people were moving around a lot, even back in the 16th century, 15th century, when they lived. And both of these composers, Isaac and Zenfel, they worked at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I in Vienna. So they spent time there. But now, before going into Haydn, I want to situate us in the 18th century. The 18th century, typically, the early part is referred to as Baroque, and same in visual art, music with all of these curls. Think of Handel and Johann Sebastian Bach. So, but the revolution against the style, in large part, was led by Bach's children, Johann Christian Bach, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. This is always the case, or usually the case, rebellious children. And what they did, the Bach's sons, they wanted to write in a style that was more based on recitative, on opera, on improvisation, on melody, and just background accompaniment. So very different spirit in their music. Also, the galant style is often referred to as style galant. This was a different consciousness from Baroque music. So now Vienna was this melting pot, like we spoke about. All of these influences, Italian music, French music, it was all coming together there. And Joseph Haydn is born into this context. I'll go to his picture over here. And there's the map of Vienna, further detail. Here's Joseph Haydn. Almost looks like George Washington, same time period. So he was born in a small town, not in Vienna, was a choir boy at St. Stephen's until his voice broke. They kicked him out then. And he's most famous for working for the Esterházys, who were a Hungarian noble family, who were loyal to the Habsburgs. Remember the disunity of the Holy Roman Empire. It was not a single unit. There were all of these different nobility that lived there. And Haydn actually had the status of a servant. He would eat with the servants, and he had to compose music for court functions. It was a good job, but he felt pretty lonely out in the sticks. There's some letters where he describes this sensation. And the palace of the Esterházys, I believe it's either right on the border with Hungary or even in Hungary. So again, our idea of national borders is sort of not so accurate in these times. Haydn said that living there, he was forced to become original. And it was after he worked for the Esterházys that he lived in Vienna for some time. At that, he taught Beethoven, actually. He was a teacher of Beethoven. He visited London and Paris, notably, and he wrote his famous London symphonies and Paris symphonies, absorbing the musical styles of those musical capitals. Now, this sonata I'm going to play is, some people, they call it a Sturm und Drang sonata, or storm and stress. This is a literary term. And it is quite a dramatic piece. However, Haydn is very well known for being a witty composer. And he achieves this, even in this dramatic music, through silences, contrasts, fragments that don't really resolve. And so there's a kind of musical rhetoric here. And he creates a narrative. I'd say that's another difference from Baroque music, earlier music, that this music, purely instrumental music, like a sonata or a symphony, it works as a narrative, or almost like an opera in music, or a novel. And I like to think of the sonata form as being connected to the novel, which was coming into its own in the 18th century. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into some Haydn. This is the sonata in B minor, first movement, from the Sturm und Drang period, 1776, which was an important year in this country. important. And it's on now. So there we go. Speaking about Mozart, there's a lot of mythology surrounding Mozart. And again, I don't mean to put him down. He's one of the greatest geniuses that ever lived. But I think the influence of his father is overlooked. Leopold Mozart was a court composer in Salzburg. And apparently, some of Mozart's early music was either partially or completely composed by Leopold. I may make some enemies saying that, but I've read somewhere that that may be the case, speculation. So this would sort of poke a hole in the whole child prodigy idea. I mean, he certainly was brilliant from an early age, but it was, I would say that it was later when Mozart matured and in his operas, his late symphonies and Requiem, where his genius really flourishes. So Mozart tooled around a bit. He was in Salzburg. He had a position, some kind of position, thanks to his father. And he wasn't too happy there. And he tried to get a job in Paris. And imagine how different music history would have been if Mozart had worked in Paris. Maybe he would have operas with ballet in them, in the French style. So there's also this myth of Mozart and Salieri. If you've seen the Milos Forman film Amadeus, which is a great film, but not historically accurate at all, you'll know this story. And the story is that Salieri was this mediocre composer who poisoned Mozart. And that is just simply not true. Salieri was a great composer. Salieri was a teacher of Beethoven and Liszt. And Mozart, they respected each other a lot. And the truth is they probably didn't know each other too well. Salieri was the court composer for Emperor Joseph II, the emperor in the movie, if you remember. And Mozart had a sort of part-time thing with the emperor, I mean, a part-time sort of employment, but Salieri was the big shot. Now, I have this belief, and I may be wrong, but this is just a theory. I believe that the myth of Mozart and Salieri took on a prominence later in the 19th century when many were trying to form an idea of German nationalism. Because who was Salieri? Salieri was from what's now Italy. So there it is, the foreigner working in Vienna having the high position. But look, our guy, Mozart, Wolfie, as they called him, why is he not in that position? So that's sort of my belief. But I think I would have played some Salieri because Salieri is, in many ways, not a very Italianate composer. His style, he was taught by Gluck, I believe, early opera composer in Vienna. So, but at any rate, Salieri doesn't have any solo piano music. That's kind of a shame. But he has some piano concertos, maybe next time. So I want you to consider Mozart's operatic genius. Think of his operas. If you haven't seen them, go see his operas go see it on YouTube. So I like to think of Mozart's instrumental music as opera. I think it's so theatrical. There's some scholars who compare his music to the Commedia dell'arte, which was the improvised theater of the day. But at any rate, Mozart's music is very theatrical. And in terms of piano playing and compositional technique, Mozart is, in a sense, very different from Haydn because he does not use these sudden contrasts and silences as much. It's more of a through-composed melodic style. By the way, Haydn wrote opera too, but we don't hear them as much now. Shame, too bad. But Mozart is more typically remembered as an opera composer. And Mozart has a quote. He said that with piano playing, it should flow like oil. And that is, I think, sort of summarizes how he writes for the piano. It's another good quote from Arthur Schnabel, who said that Mozart is too simple for children, but too complex for adults or for artists. So there it is, Mozart. I'm going to play the Rondo in D major. And I'll pull this up here. Written in 1786, just a mere 10 years after the Haydn piece that we heard. So that is Mozart. And let me get this all set up. That's Mozart. And the writer Max Harrison, in his biography of Rachmaninoff, of all people, he says that he calls Mozart's music the embodiment of the culture of Versailles. I think it's a fascinating angle. And I would add to that that if Mozart embodies this culture, this gallant culture, this sophisticated, culture of Versailles, then perhaps Beethoven embodies the spirit of the French Revolution. Remember, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, we had the French Revolution, then Napoleon comes about. He took Vienna in 1805 and 1809. Following that was this kind of reconciliation, the Congress of Vienna in 1814 and 15. And there's a quote by Charles Joseph Deligne: "The Congress does not move forward." It's not only back then, it dances. And he was speaking about this waltz craze, Johann Strauss Sr. I'm tempted to say Hank Williams Sr., but that's the next lecture. So this music actually was so popular that the people attending the Congress of Vienna, apparently that's mostly what they did. They just went out and danced. So, and you could say that this is where the Viennese myth of just lighthearted, not really caring about anything, comes about. Later, the writer Karl Kraus, satirical writer, Viennese writer, he said that in Vienna, he said in Berlin, things are serious, but they're not hopeless. He said in Vienna, things are hopeless, but they're not so serious. I think it's just a fascinating way to put it. So that brings us to Beethoven in 1801. There's a picture of him in his later years writing the Missa Solemnis. Beethoven was from Bonn, which is now Germany. So he's not a Vienna native. Now, I said he's a musical revolutionary, and it's true. But some scholars point out that he was funded by aristocrats throughout his whole life. So it's dubious. Maybe you could say his music has a revolutionary, a volcanic feeling to it. But maybe personally, it's dubious. So, like Haydn, his teacher, full of contrasts, sudden shifts of dynamics and mood and texture. And I think that this is what gives him partially this revolutionary quality. And Beethoven was a fantastic improviser, as they all were. In the question, maybe we can talk about the role of improvisation. It's a huge role, but that's just putting that out there. Softball question for me. So I'm going to play this short movement from the Beethoven Sonata in E flat major, Opus 27, number 1. This is scherzo. Scherzo means joke in Italian, but this is not really a joke. I mean, it's maybe a dark joke, but yeah. So here it is, just a whiff of the style of Beethoven. This is a middle period piece. So here we go. could see that Beethoven broke pianos in Vienna, and I imagine he upset some of the more genteel Viennese folk, Viennese people. He did have aristocratic patrons, but yeah, he maybe ruffled some feathers, you could say, with that music, so radical. So now we're going to move to another composer, Franz Schubert, who so far is the first Vienna native. And but Schubert was unknown in his lifetime. He was plagued by illness, and also he was very poor. Sometimes he didn't even have enough to eat. And he only lived 31 years, which is just, I just turned 31 yesterday. So thinking of that is just, it's unbelievable. And in the last year, he knew he didn't have much time. And he wrote so much music, including this piece, this first Klavierstücke from the drei Klavierstücke. Let's move over to Schubert here. He wrote it in 1828, as he wrote so many pieces at a breakneck speed. And I would say this, Schubert, I think I see a pattern here of styles skipping generations. Haydn skips over to Beethoven, Mozart's lyricism and gift for melody skips over to Schubert, perhaps. And Schubert is, we need to think of his Lieder, his songs. It's really the core of his output, and as an influence on what he wrote for the solo instrument, for the solo piano. Schubert had this small group of friends and they would have these concerts called the Schubertiads, these wonderful events. To be a fly on the wall and witness one of those. And they were not big time concerts. I mean, these were small private events. And so Schubert was very much celebrated by this group of people who he knew. And Alfred Brendel, a great Austrian Viennese pianist, I believe he's Viennese, he said this about Schubert. He said that when you have minor keys in Schubert's music, for example, the first part of this, it represents reality, a cold and harsh reality. But when you have major keys, it's a world of dreams and illusions. And perhaps that's very Viennese of him, to go off into fantasy land. The middle section of this piece. And I would conclude by saying that if Beethoven, people consider Beethoven the first romantic, and yes, there's a new musical consciousness in Beethoven. However, Beethoven for his whole life was something of an Enlightenment figure or thinker, that through struggle, as with his deafness, humans can overcome and can triumph. Think of the Ninth Symphony, oh boy, the last movement. But I think Schubert is the opposite. I think Schubert, ultimately, his music is pessimistic. And I think that just he retreats into a world of dreams and illusions, as in the Miller and the Brook, not Crook. What am I saying? From Die Schöne Müllerin, in which the miller speaks to the creek and says, I wish I were under your water and no longer living. I mean, it's very dark. And in some ways, this spirit is what made Schubert later a hero for the Romantics, for Liszt and for Schumann and others, and Bruckner. So, Klavierstücke in E flat minor. Moving towards the conclusion of today's presentation, uh, you could say Schubert concludes the so-called golden age of Viennese classicism, which I just said didn't really exist. Um, let's talk about the late 19th century. And this is where this Brahms piece, the Capriccio in G minor from Opus 116, comes from in the year 1892. So we move way ahead. That was 1828, Schubert, and now we're in 1892. And there's a photo. See, now we have photos. That's another thing. Technology is changing. On the left, we see Johann Strauss Jr. Then on the right, Johannes Brahms with his large beard. Who do you think's older? Well, the answer is Johann Strauss Jr. on the left, strangely. Now, they were friends. It's funny because that's why I like this picture. It's so much fin de siècle Vienna, it captures it. And they were friends, much in the same way Schoenberg and Gershwin, we're going to talk about that next, played tennis together. Because you think of Johann Strauss Jr. as this composer of basically entertainment music. I think it's wonderful. I love the waltzes. And Brahms is this serious composer who carried on the legacy of Beethoven. Well, they were very fond of each other. Apparently, they enjoyed eating paprika chicken together. Don't know where I read that, but somewhere. So Brahms comes from northern Germany. Hamburg is almost Denmark, I believe. And there was a description of his style as North Sea romanticism in his early years. And the young Brahms writes these 3 piano sonatas, and he shows up at the door of the Schumanns, Robert and Clara Schumann. Both of them were fantastic musicians, composers. And Robert Schumann declares him a genius. And he says, these sonatas are symphonies in disguise. But that was a lot of shoes to fill in. You know, it's a song by George Jones. I'm starting to point towards the next lecture on Nashville. Who's going to fill their shoes? Because Brahms, it took him like 20 years to write his first symphony because he said, I'm in the footsteps of a giant, speaking about Beethoven. How could you write a symphony after the 9th? But Brahms embodies many of the qualities of this time, late 19th century Vienna. The Ringstrasse was built at this time. It's a boulevard similar to the Haussmann boulevards in Paris. And the style of architecture is called historicist, meaning referential, referring to the past. And you could say that Brahms's music is historicist. And Brahms had a fascination with history. And this is a modern thing, you could also say. History as a discipline. I don't know, we'll ask Max, but Mozart was not, for example, Mozart and Haydn were not as interested in the past as Brahms was. Brahms was practically a scholar of early music. He had a huge library and he studied Heinrich Schütz and Johann Sebastian Bach, and he just knew all of this music. And he was a master contrapuntalist. In other words, the craft of composition is almost perfect, so perfect. But he also had this reputation for being this like arch conservative, which is not really true, but because there was another trend in Vienna and in Europe at this time, which was the trend of the so-called musical progressives. Bruckner, a great Austrian composer, and his big influence, Wagner. Now, say one thing, Wagner, you could say, yeah, he was musically progressive, but certainly not in other areas. And don't want to get all into that, but not a great guy, Wagner. So, but that's another story for another day. So, but Brahms took on this reputation as being this traditionalist. And yeah, so here is a example of one of his piano pieces. It's the A sections, the outer sections, beginning and end, are almost stormy, like that North Sea stormy German romanticism, and the middle sounds almost like a large chorale. So here it is. that's Brahms. Now, the final part of today's, oh, yeah, to turn it on, works better when it's on. So coming to the end, and I don't want to overstay my welcome here, so we need to speak a little bit about the fin de siècle in the early 20th century, La Belle Époque in Vienna, which was truly a crazy time. So if you think now is crazy, it is, but it was crazy then too. Hopefully we won't have a trajectory like Vienna's. So this was the time of build-up to World War I and World War II. And anti-Semitism, which was always a feature of Viennese life, it's a terrible part of the history of Vienna. And it's also part of the reason why the mythology just needs to be re-examined. Anti-Semitism was becoming more and more prominent. Now, hate to speak about this, but Adolf Hitler was Austrian. He was born in Austria and spent some of his formative years being rejected from art school and such in Vienna. And he was inspired by the notorious anti-Semite, the mayor of Vienna, Karl Lueger. So all of this junk was cooking in Vienna at the time. And it was also in the arts, a time of great angst. And all you need to do is just think of the paintings of Viennese expressionists. By the way, Schoenberg himself painted in this style, but Egon Schiele, Oskar Kokoschka, Gustav Klimt. It's beautiful, but it also reflects and demonstrates this really sort of a crazy atmosphere that was there. So Schoenberg was a Viennese native too, like Schubert. So there's only two Viennese natives, Schubert and Schoenberg, in this presentation. Schoenberg left the city eventually. He hated Vienna. He was discriminated there for being Jewish, even though he converted and he sort of rediscovered his Jewish roots when he came back, when he moved to the US. But first he went to Berlin, I believe in the 1920s, and then he eventually settled in Southern California, where he played tennis with Gershwin, and there's photos of him watering his lawn wearing Bermuda shorts. It's really funny, actually. So you can contrast Viennese expressionism, and I'll call Schoenberg a Viennese expressionist, contrast it with the style of Johann Strauss Jr. It's just a totally different world. And so what was going on in the music of this time, Richard Strauss, not Johann, but the music of Richard Strauss, of Mahler, who doesn't have piano music, really. I wish I could play him today. But what was going on was the music was becoming so dissonant and so saturated with dissonances that Schoenberg felt it wasn't that big of a leap to go into completely atonal music, 12-tone music. And in the 1920s, after this piece was written, because this piece, oh, let me put the photo up here. There's Schoenberg, he's quite a striking figure. Look at that face. The eyes almost look like those of Picasso. Wild. These pieces, the Sechs kleine Klavierstücken, I told you my German's not good, from 1911. This is before Schoenberg's style went fully serial or 12-tone, not Cheerios cereal, but sorry for the dad jokes, but went fully 12-tone. So this is a free atonal music. And what I found practicing it, I think Schoenberg is very misunderstood. He's often cast as this crazy modernist, but I think he was a romantic. His early music was romantic. And all throughout his life, he has an intuition in his music. And it's really beautiful. These pieces, to me, they sound almost like Japanese paintings, very spare at times. And they capture what I would call or refer to, there's a book title, I haven't read this book, but it's called Twilight in Vienna. And that's what it was. And I heard Pierre Boulez say, I went to an interview of his, and he said something to the effect of, I don't remember it completely, but he said something to the effect of, at this time, before World War I and before World War II, Vienna waltzed off of a cliff. And I think it's evident in this music. So two very short pieces. They're kleine Klavierstücken. I'll play them without interruption, and then it's been a pleasure. And that will do it for today. I forgot to mention that the final piece of the Schoenberg, that he referred to this piece as the bells at Mahler's funeral. Mahler passed away in 1911. So thank you everyone for making this event possible. And the final slide is a picture of twilight in Vienna. And I just want to say real quick before we go to the next part, I'm a big fan of country music. My dad is a country musician, and he was used to play at the Bynum Front Porch Music in Pittsburgh, not now. So I was raised on not only Vienna, but Nashville, but that's for later. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Robert, you can't hear it, but there is just rapturous applause going on in a virtual world. And I know that you're hearing my disembodied voice come over the stage. So all of this is so bizarre, but I just want to say that was an absolutely beautiful presentation. You took us through, a century and a half of Viennese music, if not more. And your playing was absolutely exquisite.
Thank you.
We had some visual difficulty early on, Robert, which you were not aware of, but the playing came through great. And I think by the second or third piece, we had everything streaming perfectly. So we apologize for everybody who had a problem seeing Robert's hands going across the keyboard so beautifully. But we know that we had that fixed at the end. So we do have some questions for you. And I want to start out with Paul Connick says, thank you so much. Do you have any desire to return at some point to perform at the Scuola de Musica in Castelnuovo de Garfagna in Lucca?
If they let me.
And if so, we look forward to seeing you there. So yes, that's an answer, is you do have a desire to go back and play there.
Well, after COVID, of course, but.
Can you give me some personal experiences that you might have had? Have you played in Vienna yourself, and in some of these halls, or in any, or heard some of this music? Do the physical spaces in Vienna offer anything to the acoustic experience?
Unfortunately, I haven't been. I was going to go
Mm-hmm.
this summer, and I was going to play. I know, but did this instead. I was going to play a program of all U.S. American composers. Which is because I felt I didn't have much to add for the Viennese. So, but still, my grandparents, on my father's side, my mother's a Russian immigrant, so Soviet. So that's where the classical love came in. My dad's a Southern American guy, and that's where the country and bluegrass comes in. But his parents, my father's parents, they loved Vienna, and they traveled there so often. And I have a number of paintings that they bought there. My grandmother, sadly, she passed away last year, and but she would speak about Vienna all the time, and we'd watch those New Year's Day concerts on PBS. So I feel as if I've been there, although I haven't, sadly.
It's interesting how how our sort of music can take us places anyway, because I certainly felt like the last hour I've been in Vienna. Are there some composers that you haven't, that if you had more time, are there other composers you associate with Vienna? I know you've mentioned many names, but are any particular pieces that you would have also added to this if you had a choice?
Well, there are a number of composers. I even heard one on the radio last night when I was getting eye drops. They have this swollen eye, and I forget the name. It was like Tiefer or something, and they said from Vienna. And so there's a composer, Franz Schrecker. There's so many composers that are unknown, and unjustly so. So I would want to explore them. I would love to play Salieri's piano concertos. He has two, and they're beautiful. Of course, more famous works by Beethoven, by Brahms, the sonatas, late sonatas of Beethoven. There's also the Sonata Opus 1 by Alban Berg, who was a student of Schoenberg, and also Webern, another student of Schoenberg. So there's just so much music, and I think it was Van Cliburn said that a lifetime is enough for music, but music is, music is just too much for one lifetime. And Vienna, the same thing. That's why I recorded this thing yesterday as a test, and I told Max that it was an hour and 40 minutes of just me blabbing. So I really had to be careful. I'm sorry I went over, but the answer is that there's just so much it would be impossible. But hopefully, I'll get to touch on as many as I can in my life. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you for that question. I have a question here from James and Joan Evans. It's actually, the first is pretty simple. When did you start playing piano? And they loved your playing and say thank you for it. And then asking you about your top waltz composers.
Okay, top waltz composers. So I started playing at like 3 or 4, but I was no child prodigy at all. So very un-Mozartian. I had to struggle and suffer later. Um, so my favorite waltz composer, I can't pick one, but I do love Johann Strauss Jr. And by the way, there's a transcription of his beautiful Blue Danube by Schultz Evler, I think, and that's a crazy piece. But didn't have time to learn it for this. But there's another piece I could do. I love Chopin's waltzes, although those are more idiosyncratically Chopin. Viennese waltzes, I mean, well, Brahms has waltzes. I forgot to mention, by the way, Brahms has Hungarian dances. The arch classicist conservative, he also had this folk-inspired music. So Ravel's La Valse, which is in many ways a depiction, even though Ravel is a French Basque, I believe, or Gascon composer, he was in La Valse reflecting on Viennese culture. So that's the short answer, but there's just so much more.
We certainly, as we mentioned at the when I was introducing you, we were going to have you do some Chopin for us in at Flyleaf Books, so maybe we'll get to hear those waltzes in a future program. We do hope.
I'm kidding.
We have an anonymous question for you. This is: do you think that the surrounding political culture affects the ways in which composers compose music?
Absolutely, absolutely. Composers are people; they don't live in a vacuum. Yeah.
So you can certainly, and that's why we wonder what kind of music is being composed today.
And we'll find out because history usually shows. Unfortunately, remember, a lot of these people were not celebrated in their own lifetimes, and that's really tragic, especially Schubert.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that great music is being written today. It's just a matter of being open to where it's coming from. Arvo Pärt, there's one great composer living. So.
Well, I tell you one thing, there is one great pianist living in with us right now, and that is Robert Buxton. Robert, I want to thank you so much for this absolutely brilliant presentation and your brilliant playing. This is a real treat for all of us here at Carolina Public Humanities, and of course, for all of us in the virtual world watching. So thank you, Robert. We'll be joining us for the panel session, and we look forward to talking and learning more from you later.
Wonderful. Thank you, Max, and thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you.